Well, it is road trip season, and today we are taking you on a virtual tour of some of the natural spaces that make this province so special. We hear about some of the wildlife, the landscapes, and geology that are worth seeking out. So if you're interested in snakes and short-horned lizards, burrowing owls, or lake sturgeon, you'll want to stick around. But we know many of you live in some pretty special places, so you can call in and tell us about your favorite places to view wildlife in this province. 1-800-716-2221 is the number to dial, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, our guest today will give you a new appreciation for the landscapes around you. Dale Leckie is a professional geologist and professor of Earth and Environment and Energy at the University of Calgary. He's also the author of the new book, Wildlife, Landscape, and Geology, an Alberta and Saskatchewan touring guide. We do have one copy of the book to give away to someone who calls in today. That number is 1-800-716-2221. And if you don't win this copy, you can go buy your own tomorrow night at his book launch at McNally Robinson here in Saskatoon. Dale is in town for the book launch, and he's joining me here in our Saskatoon studio. Dale, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hey, hi, Leisha. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, and you've got the book in front of you right there.
I do, yeah.
Maybe describe the cover for people.
So the cover is burrowing owls. And so burrowing owls we've got in southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta. And their lifestyle is really, really interesting because they live in the burrows of other animals which might normally be predators or that they share the landscape with. In Grasslands National Park in southwest Saskatchewan, you find them in the burrows of the black-tailed prairie dogs. And that's really neat. They'll go and they'll occupy it. They'll lay their eggs there. They'll store food there. And they come out, they're probably, the size of a small Coke bottle. And they eat wildlife, grasshoppers, voles, mice, and things like that. And they're really, really interesting to see and to watch for. And they're an endangered species. And so the fact that we've got them in the spectacular landscape, which is Grasslands National Park, I think is so neat.
Yeah, and such a reason to put them on the cover of a book. Let's give them more attention, right?
Exactly. In the books that I do, I try and include art. In this book, I included wildlife art done digitally by a friend of mine who designed the book. But I also included landscape art of Dean Francis, who lives down in southwest Saskatchewan at Sagebrush Art Galleries. And he does beautiful work, and he put a bunch of his pictures into the book. And the reason I like to include art is I'm a scientist, I'm a geologist, and I can scare people away sometimes.
Why, just by being too sciencey?
Well, exactly. Sometimes I think that if you put the word geology on the cover of a book, you may as well say astrophysics.
Yeah, it's not really a vacation,
no,
a light summer read.
Exactly. And so by putting the art in there, I let the reader of the book and the people that are going out to tour following the book look at the landscape through the eyes of an artist, not just a scientist like myself. And that's why I like to include the art in the books. And people seem to love it. So
what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've written 2 books already on the scenic geology of Alberta, and everywhere that I go, and my wife and I travel all summer long across the 2 provinces, and we kept seeing animals in certain areas, and it got me thinking about, well, is there a dependency on where some of these animals live, or their lifestyles, or life cycles, if you will, and the landscape that they live in? And I started digging into that, and as a result, I found that a lot of animals, where they live, it is a result of their habitat as a result of the geology that's there. And I'm always looking for spectacular scenery, and to me, spectacular scenery is caused by geology as well.
Well, and I mean, that's why we're calling this show a Saskatchewan road trip, because you can go places and see beautiful scenery and also dig a bit deeper to see who else is living in that landscape.
Exactly.
So how did you go about doing research for this book?
So what we do is every spring, summer, and fall, my wife and I, we just travel around the province. We quite often camp. We don't want to camp on the ground anymore, so we comfort camp. The glamping, if you will, and we love that. That way, your bed's at knee height. You don't have to crawl off the ground. And from those, we use those as a basis to explore, and that's what we do all summer long. And then during the winter or when the weather's miserable, I start researching it, and I try not to put anything in the book that I haven't researched. And this book, the first theme is wildlife, so it got me going into different topics that I really normally wouldn't get into. Marilyn and I, my wife, we're naturalists. Anyways, we're amateur naturalists. We love being outdoors. This afternoon, we're going to go to Beaver Creek and explore it, just because it's such a beautiful place south of town that we've heard so much about.
Oh, and you'll have to feed the chickadees? That's the favorite activity to do there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I do it. I research all winter long, and then I try and write it in a way that it's understandable by the general public. My whole idea is to get this message, and your theme here today is summer road trip. I want people out exploring summer, spring, and using my book as a guide, and I think I bring it down so that people can understand what's in the book, what the geology is about, and what the wildlife are doing.
And this appreciation then also for Saskatchewan, which is something we talk a lot about, right? We heard the people who in the newscast there who were told just to skip over Saskatchewan, which is something we hear all the time, and we need to challenge that.
People tell me that all the time. Are you going to Saskatoon? Oh, I'm going to fall asleep. And I love the road trip. Yesterday's trip was phenomenal, coming from Calgary, driving through Kindersley, Flaxcombe. I could tell you about the geology of Flaxcombe if you want.
I'm curious. I'm curious.
In Saskatoon. Well, just outside of Flaxcombe is a big boulder, and we call them glacial erratics. It was a big block carried by the ice during the last glaciation, and it was let down when the ice melted. So what's that got to do with wildlife? Well, there's a big pit that has been a pathway that's all around that big boulder just outside of Flaxcombe, and it's where the bison used to rub off their winter pelt. So I talk about bison and bison rubbing stones in the book because that's the relationship, bison to these big glacial erratics. They've got fur or hair, a pelt that's 3 to 5 inches long, if you will, 10 centimeters, and it's too hot when it's 30 or 35 above. So they have to rub that off, and they use the glacial erratics carried by the ice to get rid of it. And that's what you can see at Flaxcombe.
See, that drive is very interesting.
I think it is.
What about some of the other places in Saskatchewan, the natural spaces in the province that you find most interesting?
Oh, I'm going to say, well, I always talk about Grasslands National Park, and it's in Badlands in southwest Alberta. And Badlands across Alberta, Saskatchewan. But here in Saskatchewan, they erode every year about 0.5 centimeter per year from those big thunderstorms that hit the area. And so you've got these valleys, you've got these remnant valleys, you've got these hills that are there. And it's really great habitat. We just talked about the burrowing owl. It's great habitat for the greater shorthorned lizard. It's great habitat for certain snakes. That you find. And these animals, these reptiles, they're at the northern extent of their range. It's too cold for them normally, but they live on the south-facing slopes of the Badlands. Another place that I really like going to is the Great Sandhills Ecological Reserve down in southwest Saskatchewan. It's sand dunes.
Yeah.
And in sand dunes, why do we have so many sand dunes across Saskatchewan? Most people don't realize it, but when you drive, let's say yesterday's drive for me, coming from Calgary here to Saskatoon, whenever I find land that has not been agriculturally disturbed, and I think we need the agriculture, it's usually in Badlands or it's in sand dunes and rolling topography. It's too sandy. Our grain crops won't grow there. But in the Great Sandhills Ecological Reserve, we've got a really interesting little mammal called the Ord's kangaroo rat. It's about 10 to 15 centimeters high. It's got feet that look like a kangaroo's foot, and it's got a tail like a kangaroo's tail.
You're kidding.
It just hops around on the sand out there, and it only comes out at night.
Okay, so it's not something that's easy to see.
But it is if you go out there at midnight, and you take your flashlight, and it's just like if you catch a deer in the headlights, it'll stop and freeze. And so will the Ord's kangaroo rat. And it's really worth the trip. You can look
So that's something that you've done?
I have, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Yeah, out there all by yourself, or with your spouse. Yeah.
With Marilyn, yeah,
but
exactly.
That must be just such a unique experience. I've never done anything like that at midnight.
It is. It's worth doing. Go north of Leader. That's where you're going to find, and south of Scepter. That's where you're going to find the ecological reserve. Another place that I really like is I just lost it. Saskatchewan Landing Provincial Park. It's another one of your great parks. And, a lot of it's been flooded, but we've got its Badlands topography, its glacial terrain, and there's a lot of animals that we can find in through there as well.
Like what? Like what would be some examples from there?
Some of the animals in that area, you're going to find the pronghorn antelope. And pronghorn antelope, we can just talk about them for a little bit. You'll get them further south towards grasslands, and further south, mostly where you find native areas, natural prairies. Pronghorn antelope are the fastest animal that we've got in North America. They can see movement up to 5 kilometers away, and that's their defense mechanism. On the flat prairies, they used to be able to see 10, 20,000 years ago, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats coming, and they would take off in a hurry. And so they can do a burst speed if they're being attacked of about 100 kilometers per hour. Think about that.
Oh my gosh.
That's pretty amazing. When
That
you
is
get
amazing.
Yeah.
We're going to spend some more time in the grasslands area. We've got someone standing by who does a lot of work in Val Marie. But before we introduce him, I just want to give you an opportunity to pick up on some of the animals that you mentioned from there. Like, I want to know more about the short-horned lizards.
Well, the greater short-horned lizard, it is really an interesting one. It's about 4 inches long, 3 inches long, so we'll say 8 to 10 centimeters long. And it's a reptile. It only comes out when it's warm, but if it gets too hot, it hides in the boulders. And you'll usually find it on south-facing slopes. It eats ants and grasshoppers. And an interesting thing about the greater shorthorn lizard is one of the predators that goes after it is the loggerhead shrike. And the loggerhead shrike is called the butcher bird.
It's a great name.
It's a funny name, and the thing with the loggerhead shrike is it doesn't have a claw on its feet, and one single claw to grab its prey. It's the only songbird or one that species shrikes that is a predator that goes after meat. And so it'll capture these greater shorthorn lizards and it'll skewer them on hawthorn branches, or if you're driving along the countryside, southern Saskatchewan, and you see these bits of meat on a barbed wire fence, it's put them on the skewers, on the barbs.
Oh my goodness.
Pretty interesting to see.
That's fascinating. Okay, well, what an interesting part of the province, no doubt. Let's go to our next guest, who has called Val Marie home for quite some time. He's also worked in the Grasslands National Park and is an expert in all things amphibian. He just started as curator at the Royal Alberta Museum, and that's where we've reached him today. Nick Cairns, welcome to Blue Sky.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you. So we're just gushing about grasslands. I think it's fair to say we've been gushing. I love grasslands and the whole Val Marie area. What makes it such a special spot to you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things about that place, both geologically and community-wise, that make it special. But I think you can see how special it is when you drop down into the valley and you see what glacial outwashes have done and made this big, wide valley, all these badlands. This year it's particularly nice because the early season stuff has been pushed back with this cold, wet weather, and the mid-season stuff is getting pushed forward with the sun we're getting now. And so now there's all sorts of things blooming together, and some of the grass is going to seed all together. So right now it's like a weird mixture of this blue golden haze from all the stipa grasses that are going to seed, those big long needle and thread grasses. And then at the same time, you're getting all the June grasses and this silky blue tinge from the sage. It's a really nice year down there this year.
And are you familiar with was it called the great shorthorn lizards that
Yeah, so I've been working on greater shorthorn lizards for a number of years. I primarily look at their overwintering habits. So actually another critical element of a relationship between geology and wildlife. Shorthorn lizards don't really occur in areas where they can't get below ground, but they don't go deep enough to escape the freezing. So they need to find these areas that accumulate snow, but also have a substrate that they can bury themselves in. So these eroded slopes in grasslands area, bear paw shale is a critical feature to their habitat. And they need these little washes that fill with snow every year because the snow, at least from our limited data that we've got so far, they select areas with more snow, which probably limits the amount of freeze-thaw cycle they're getting because they do appear to be in areas that get frozen.
I just want to back up. You called it bear paw shale?
Bear paw shale, yeah. It's a Cretaceous silt deposits that are open and quite common in southeastern Alberta, southwestern Saskatchewan. It's a great spot for fossils, but it also happens to be a great spot for horned lizards as well.
Horned lizards.
The substrate that we associate with them.
And also Mormon meadowlark, an endangered butterfly?
Mormon meadowlarks. Their two host plants both require these big open south-facing slopes of bear paw shale, and so they actually lay their eggs in the cracked soil because it's too hot to lay them on the surface of the leaves of the plants, and then at night they come out and consume the plant and then go back into the soil during the day. It's a very intense landscape, both in the winter and in the summer, but it's a spectacular landscape.
I'm wondering, Nick, if you can talk about how travelers, people who are on a road trip, who might be stopping and doing a camping trip at grasslands, could take in some of this. Like unless you're looking closely, you know what to look for, you know where to go. I don't know how likely it is to see a Mormon meadowlark. Probably not, since it's an endangered butterfly. But just, I'm wondering if you can talk about all of this from that lens. Like you're on a family trip, you've got your kids with you. How do you see some of these cool things?
Yeah, well, I have two young kids as well, and they've been walking that prairie since they could walk, and there are ways to do it with just about every age and ability. Grasslands National Park does have several trails that are fairly accessible, so there are places where you can put a stroller out and go for a walk and see some of these species. The best way to do it would be to, when you get there, come and talk to someone at the park and let them know what your abilities and expectations are, and then bring way more water than you think you need, because that's the thing that gets most people in trouble, is not bringing enough water. But there's some lovely trails, and for people that are particularly healthy, good hikers, there's a million places where you can just enjoy and get lost in the back end of the park. It's a spectacular place. Different species show up at different times, just the way that flowers bloom at different times. Right now, the cactus flowers are just starting. We got to see our first couple this weekend. And that changes the whole insect community of the place. So when people come down to either Val Marie side, or if they come down to the East Block, the first place I would stop is at the visitor center and talk to one of the folks there, because they're fantastic.
Can we talk for a moment about the rattlesnakes?
We sure can.
How likely is it to see one? I was told that you deal with snakes like on a daily basis. I didn't think it was that likely to come across a rattlesnake.
I make sure I come into contact with them as often as possible. So I did a lot of the snake removals for the park when I worked for the park. I love rattlesnakes. That was the reason I moved to Val Marie in the first place.
Really?
Yeah.
That's the reason you moved to Val Marie in the first place?
I started going there when I was in 1999 with my parents. I started going there every year, multiple years, to go see the snake dens. And then I ended up moving next door to my wife and stayed.
That's
a
great story.
Yeah. And so the snakes brought me, and the community kept me. But no, the snakes are fantastic. And people that don't interact with rattlesnakes have this perception of them as quick moving, irritable creatures. I have literally stepped on, like actually put my foot on 3 of them accidentally in my times wandering around. Not to mention how close I've come to hundreds of others, and I've never had one put a fang in me or my boot. Good. People need to be careful because they, if you disturb them, they will strike in self-defense. But they are slow, quite calm snakes compared to something like a racer or some of the other snakes that are a little more fast but non-venomous. So I mean, I think it's a low risk, high impact.
Okay, we want to encourage people to do these road trips and to go.
I think the most important thing that when people are doing a road trip in that area is just watching the road. That's how you actually see snakes. You can hike all day, and if you don't go to the right spot, if you don't go find the right erratic, as Dale was saying, you won't see a snake out hiking a lot of the time. But in the mornings when people are getting out of their campsites and going for their first drive through the park, that's often when there's snakes on the road. But people are so blown away by the visage of the park, by the valley, by the rocks, by the river, by the bison, they miss out on the fact that there's a snake on the road. And so we do get roadkills in that area too. People are far more harmful to snakes than the snakes are to the people that come there.
Dale, when you've done your travels through there, have you come across some rattlesnakes? I'm just wondering what you're thinking about from that geology perspective as you listen to Nick talk.
Well, so Nick talked about the bear paw shales, those silts. That was an old sea that occupied southern Saskatchewan, almost to central, all the way through Saskatchewan up to Saskatoon. Probably 70 million years old. And so those lizards and the snakes and the butterfly all live in that marine shales, the marine mud rocks from that old shallow sea that occupied this part of the world. And that's the relationship of geology to where those animals live. The other thing is, he talked about the meltwater channels or the big valleys. Well, they were cut. The big valley, the Frenchman River Valley, deep valley there, was cut when the ice melted. There was a big lake somewhere off to the west, and it drained catastrophically and cut that valley. And it creates that habitat for a lot of animals. The Capel Valley is the same thing. It was cut by a glacial lake that's catastrophically drained and cut this big valley all across central Saskatchewan, again, creating great habitat for a lot of different animals.
And what other habitat, Nick? I want to ask you about the bison, obviously, and the relationship with Richardson ground squirrels. But before we maybe talk about that, what other wildlife, Nick, do you want to point out for people if they're heading to the grasslands?
Well, I think it's important to point out some of the things people see at night, because again, driving on those roads and walking around at night, there's some really neat wildlife, especially if you're in the East Block. There's spadefoot toads. They're not actually a toad. They're a mesobrac. They're a type of frog, but they're quite toad-like in appearance. The typifying element for them is they have vertical pupils, like a cat does. They'd be Saskatchewan's only frog that would have a vertical pupil, and you'll see them quite often in the East Block. In the West Block, they're a little rarer, but in both blocks, you'll see some really other cool nocturnal rodents, like the kangaroo rats. We have another heteromycid in southwestern Saskatchewan called the olive-back pocket mouse, or olive-sided pocket mouse, and it's another relation to the kangaroo rat, but not nearly as agile or majestic. It's a much smaller mouse. It's a seed feeder, similar to kangaroo rats. They have these huge cheek pockets that go all the way over their shoulders, and they're lined with fur so they don't lose any moisture to the seeds, and then the seeds sprout and they waste their meal. And you'll see them quite common on the roads at night in Grasslands National Park. Similarly, you can see grasshopper mice, which are another mouse, but these are large predatory mice, and they actually eat the horned lizards as well.
Oh my goodness, they I don't know if I want to see those.
Horned lizards.
Oh, sure. Okay.
You have to root for the horned lizards.
Okay, let's pause for a second. I want to check in with Kate McGilvery. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You are listening to Blue Sky. Today, we're taking you on an audio road trip through the province. One of our guests today is Dale Leckie. He's the author of the new book, Wildlife, Landscape, and Geology, an Alberta and Saskatchewan touring guide. And we also have with us for a bit Nick Cairns, who has called Val-Marie home for quite some time. You've been talking about some things, Nick, that I did not see on my trip to the grasslands, but I want to ask you about some of the things I did, like the prairie dog population, and then we'll get to the bison in a second. But Nick, I just want to ask you not only about the prairie dog population, but the reintroduction of the black-footed ferret into Grasslands National Park. What's the story there?
Well, that's probably a Parks Canada question from my perspective. The reintroduction, I think, has been largely reported as it didn't take. Unfortunately, there was an outbreak potential outbreak of sylvatic plague, and that caused a decline in the number of prairie dogs, which essentially meant there wasn't enough food for the black-footed ferrets. So for a number of years there was ferrets, but unfortunately I don't think there's been ferrets there for quite a few years. So
how's the prairie dog population doing though now?
I don't know how exactly it's doing this. It was up for a while, and then it might be down. There are natural cycles to any animal like this. I think for the years that I was working, it was up. But I think last year might have been a slightly harder year. Years with moisture tend to be harder on prairie dogs. Dry years tend to be better. And so there's a natural cycle to them. But I think there's some fantastic staff at Parks Canada that I would talk to that actually they do monitor the number of prairie dogs every year. They monitor both the number of individuals, the number of pups, and the area they take up. So there's lots of information out there. I just probably am not the person to give you that.
Yeah, fair. That's fair. You've given us a lot of other information. I'll ask you one last question, Nick, before we let you go, because you're now living in Alberta. And so is there anything found in southwest Saskatchewan that they don't have in Alberta that you want to share with us? You know, it's kind of a question about what you'll miss most about living in Saskatchewan.
Oh, well, I mean, they don't have Val-Marie in Alberta. So it's a big loss for me and my family. I have horned lizards here. It's just I have to drive a lot further than my 10-minute drive before. So I think just having those reptiles and amphibians in my backyard was pretty spectacular. I'm trying to continue on with a lot of the research I was doing there here. But yeah, I won't have the community anymore, and I'm going to miss that.
Yeah. Well, so good to have you on the show today, Nick. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
That is Nick Cairns, the newly appointed curator at the Royal Alberta Museum, but until recently he called Val Marie home. And if you are in that part of the province, you will likely see some prairie dogs, the bison. Before we talk more with our main guest today, Dale Leckie, I just want to share a few emails because we're asking you about the best spots in Saskatchewan to see wildlife. And so Vanessa writes, for those who can't get out on road trips, do not despair. For one can stay in our largest city and see beautiful scenery and wildlife. I think we are so very fortunate to see wildlife right in the heart of Saskatoon, as in spotting beavers while walking along the Meewasin Trail. It's also a treat to see gophers and Canada geese near the river and in parks. Keith writes, our favorite place to view mammals in Saskatchewan and all of North America is in national parks or wildlife sanctuaries where there is no hunting, because everywhere else there is less wildlife, and what's left is nervous and much harder to spot. Birding, though, can be done anywhere, including our backyard. I'll share one more here from Delwyn. Our farm has a lake portion, untouched native land, a creek, plus our cultivated area. We observe, without going anywhere far, a great variety of flora and fauna. In fact, Sunday after supper, we had a fox in our yard. It was not very red, but somewhat whitish. It took its time in the yard. It was enjoyable to see what it does and how it operates. Delwyn, thank you. If you call us today, you could win a copy of the book that Dale's got here, Wildlife, Landscape, and Geology, an Alberta and Saskatchewan Touring Guide, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Dale, do you want to talk about prairie dogs and bison and their relationship to one another and the relationship to Richardson ground squirrels? There's a lot of connection that can happen there.
No, for sure. So we talked about the black-tailed prairie dogs, and whenever I go down into grasslands, we do see a lot of them. It is a reserve, it is a preserve for them. And the interesting relationship between the black-tailed prairie dog, I'll say, and the bison and the burrowing owls. Well, the burrowing owls, as I said, they inhabit the burrows of the black-tailed prairie dog. Well, the prairie dog eat a lot of the vegetation. They strip the area. They strip their colonies of vegetation. There'd just be really short grasses and mosses or lichens growing there. And so as a result, the burrowing owl can see predators coming because the threat is thus reduced. And it also creates visibility for it to see grasshoppers, voles, mice, and things like that it dines upon. So there's a relationship there between the black-tailed prairie dog and the burrowing owl. The burrowing owl, when it goes down into the holes, one of the predators will go after it. Coyotes, you'll see the coyotes perhaps chasing them, perhaps the American badger going after them. Well, the burrowing owl, when it's in the burrow and there's a predator there, it'll mimic a rattlesnake. It'll make a sound that sounds like the rattles of a rattlesnake to maybe scare that predator off. The same thing with the bison. The bison, they're grazing in that area. And they keep the grasses short. Traditionally, when we used to have the millions and tens of millions of them across North America, they would graze certain areas. They would strip it of vegetation. And that, too, would facilitate where the burrowing owls live. And again, from that, also the greater short-horned lizards. Just to branch off a little bit about the bison, the American bison. They lived all across North America. They lived in the Rocky Mountain foothills east to New York. They lived up in northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, down to Florida. So it's really hard to see any geological controls in where they live, except they needed those big boulders in Canada to rub their fur off. And that was the theme that I took for dealing with the bison in the book.
So interesting. Should we go to another part of the province?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've got someone else on the line ready to talk about all things flora and fauna. Naturalist and author Trevor Harriott knows more than just birds, although we do know him here on Blue Sky for Birdline. Trevor, of course, has crisscrossed the province, seeking out interesting flora and fauna and taking in some really interesting landscapes. He's been listening to the show and he joins us right now. Trevor, welcome back to Blue Sky.
Thanks, Leisha. Hi, Dale and Nick. Happy to be here. This is a great topic. I love talking about this stuff.
I know, it's super fun. I'm learning a lot. So, Trevor, what Saskatchewan geology do you find fascinating?
Well, I think whenever I'm out on the land, I'm always considering the landscape, how it was formed. It's always in the background, if not the foreground. And in prairie places, I mean, if you're at wetlands or you're at a prairie lake or a creek, just on a grassy hilltop, even our bigger rivers, all of that comes from the glacial period. Now, that's the recent geological history, but it's in some ways, I guess, the most significant. It's not like the Bear Paw Formation, but this stuff that's here on the surface is really what has made landscapes that are, 12 to 15,000 years old. So I think of them as old growth ecosystems, whether you're in just a little prairie creek or sitting at the local wetland, like Delwyn mentioned, describing his farm. All those components are there in the prairie landscape, south of the forest, especially, where I focus a lot of my time. But I especially like the Qu'Appelle watershed and all of its tributaries. I've spent most of my time in that area, and there's just so much to see there. I think of this stuff as like kind of the gifts of the glacier, what the glaciers had left to us. I mean, the best pieces of native prairie we've got remaining are in places that have very poor soil for growing crops, but that's because the glaciers, left more sand, gravel in those places, and thank goodness it did, because that's why we still have some native prairie.
Yeah. Do you see it that way, Dale? The gifts of the glaciers?
That's exactly the way I look at it. I think most of Saskatchewan's landscape, especially the southern half of that landscape, is the result of the glaciers. The glaciers scraping away. The glaciers when they melted. And they had these large lakes that covered much of Saskatchewan, creating valleys like the Qu'Appelle Valley. Just before we go back to Trevor, we had 3 to 4 kilometers of ice above us here in Saskatoon when the glaciers were here 20,000 years ago. That ice stripped away virtually all of the soil that was beneath it on the land surface. It stripped away all of the vegetation. So 15,000 years ago, when the ice started melting away, moving out of Saskatchewan, there was no vegetation, there was no soil. And everything we see that Trevor's going to talk about has migrated in the last 12 to 15,000 years. And that's not very long from a geologic perspective. And when I think about that, it's just an absolutely amazing thing.
That is not something that I thought of the last time I drove through the Qu'Appelle Valley, Trevor. And I'm assuming most people aren't really thinking that way when they drive through the valley.
Yeah, well, like the Frenchman River, the Dale was talking about, it's a glacial meltwater channel. There was a great big ice dam above it that rested for a period, and then the water pouring off of that surface just in a catastrophic way gushed to the east off the surface and then headed east, and it carved a much bigger valley than there is now. So it has what we call an underfit stream that's really not proportional to the size of the valley that appears to have been created. I like to try to imagine what it would have been like to see that big pour of river coming down the valley at some time, because now we just have this sleepy little Oxbow River instead. That's still very important and is continuing to bring sediment to the valley. And you think of how the Qu'Appelle Lakes were formed. It's very interesting. And some of the most ecologically rich areas where the fish are spawning, where the birds are, and these spots where the Qu'Appelle lakes are all divided up, and they used to be all one big lake. But as more and more siltation has happened from tributaries coming from the north and south, it has split the lakes into 4 lakes with these what are called alluvial fans. Fort Qu'Appelle is on an alluvial fan, and so those things that have great impacts for wildlife, for fish especially, and other creatures too. But it's just it's a fascinating thing to think of. And Qu'Appelle Lake right now is in the process of possibly being split in 2, with a couple of fans that are coming across from Qu'Appelle Lake Point and another one from the south. They eventually could, if enough silting happens, join, and we'd have 2 lakes there.
Oh, that's so interesting. Wow. Okay, so tell me about some of the plants or animals, Trevor, that you find most interesting in the area.
Well, the Qu'Appelle watershed most of it is in aspen parkland. So some of the rarer grasses there would be rough fescue on the hillsides, the native prairie grasses. But like Nick mentioning, the spear grasses, we still have lots of spear grasses. You go far enough east in the Qu'Appelle, you start to see the big blue stem grasses. There's even a little bit of side oats grama and stuff like that. So, the walls of the Qu'Appelle Valley are still holding onto the grassland because they can't really be cultivated for growing crops. So the native grassland and native vegetation there on a year like this is just spectacular. It's in tremendous shape. We're seeing really good flush of flowers last 3 years have been pretty tough.
So this,
But,
I was actually wondering about that, though, because I mean, the native plants are supposed to thrive in kind of the conditions that we've had for the last few years. But so this year would be particularly good, though, because of the rain?
I think so. They're just blooming more. The plants seem bigger. I don't think that's just me, with my amateur naturalist eye. I think that's a real thing that the plants are more exuberant and they're blooming more. So I would assume that means that they're going to reproduce better, set more seed, and so on, and they can then make it through the next drought, which we will get. There'll be another one. There's always been drought. I'm fascinated by how in the dry years those plants just kind of hold on. They just barely put out a little. Some of the flowers were so short and skimpy over the last couple of years during the drought, and now they're just much more profuse and beautiful. So yeah, that's just part of the cycles. But in terms of wildlife in the Eastern Coupelle, the bigger animals, actually, the kind of charismatic megafauna are getting more common. There's more bears now. The bears are coming further west in the Coupelle. There's more elk than there were. I'm not exactly sure why this is all happening. We've got bald eagles nesting up and down the valley. I see them regularly. It's like, ho hum, another bald eagle.
Another bald eagle.
Yeah, it's kind of the way it's getting now. People report them to me all the time. We have land south of Indian Head. We had a bear this year. We've had 4 bull elk sitting in one of the pastures on the neighbor's land, and lots of deer. And we've had cougars in the past, and so there's that kind of wildlife in these little remnant little tributaries. They're so important to that wildlife, like little corridors that are connecting the web of all the different tributaries of the Coupelle watershed. It's fun to pay attention to.
Fascinating. Dale, ho-hum, another bald eagle. What have you been noticing in the Coupelle Valley?
So Trevor mentioned seeing bears there, seeing elk there, seeing moose there. Well, I'm the geologist, remember? Let's relate that to geology. So why do we have moose, elk, and grizzly bears, or the bears in that part of the world? It all relates to the glaciations, to the last ice age. So we're going to go back 15 to 22,000 years ago. We had those kilometers of ice that covered North America, northern half of North America. Sea levels fell, and so the grizzly bear, migrated from Russia to North America. It came down south. Elk did the same thing, and so did the moose about 15,000 years ago. So
my mind's blowing.
I keep relating animals to geologic events that happened today, yesterday, and long in the past, because it affects so much much of what we see.
Yeah. Well, I think we've inspired people to head out on a Saskatchewan road trip. Trevor, I'm curious. We've had you focusing on the Coupelle Valley today, but do you have any plans to check out any different areas of the province over the summer? Where are you heading?
Actually, yeah. In a couple of weeks, I'll be up Waskesiu in the Emma Lake area, which of course has a slightly different geology as you get further north up there. Soil's a little different, and the moisture different, so you get forest and so on. And then later in August, I'll be spending a couple of days in the East Block. I'll keep my eyes peeled for those shorthorn lizards, and maybe see I still haven't seen the toad yet. Gotta go out at night, right, Nick? I guess I gotta get out there at night with a flashlight.
Yeah.
When it's wet and when it's raining is a good time.
That helps, yeah. And then, Trevor, any places on your Saskatchewan geology bucket list left to see? Anywhere you haven't been, or maybe a place you just want to spend more time? Or
if somebody would pay my ticket to get up to the Athabasca Sand Dunes, I'd go in a heartbeat. But it's expensive.
You and me both.
To get there. Yeah, and the geology there, of course, with the William River and all that, is beautiful and fascinating. So I'd love to see it.
Yeah. Dale, you haven't been up there, have you?
I haven't been up there,
no.
But I know it well as well from geological studies.
Yeah. Do you want to just talk a bit about that? And Trevor, I guess we can say goodbye to you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
Congratulations
Bye, Trevor.
on the book, Dale. Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
That's Trevor Harriet, a naturalist and author, and a friend of Blue Sky as our regular birdline guest. Yeah, Dale, I mean, there's so many interesting places in the province, and the Athabasca Sand Dunes would definitely be up there.
Yeah, the Athabasca Sand Dunes are really interesting because it's the dunes that are flowing into Lake Athabasca, or the rivers are flowing into Lake Athabasca. And when the water levels are low, we've got the really strong winds blowing, and those strong winds are blowing the sands that are being carried by the river. And I just think that's so neat to see. They're the biggest dunes we've got across Canada. We've got sand dunes, as I say, in Southwest. We've got them near Outlook, but those are so big and they're so spectacular. And it's because, again, the river's flowing into the lake and there's all this sand that's exposed in the flats, and we've got these really strong winds. And the strong winds, they blow hard, obviously, and they create those really, really, really large dunes that are always migrating around, moving in the wind.
So interesting. We got an email from May that I will share with you. May writes, I love walking along Wascana Creek along the trail. The variety of wildlife I can see, the birds, the muskrats, the beaver, is tremendous. It is such a wonderful way to spend some de-stressing time. Yeah, I think most of us are like May. We're either walking along Wascana Creek or we're heading out to Beaver Creek, not so much taking a trip all the way to the Athabasca Sand Dunes.
Yes.
But where else would you suggest, on a Saskatchewan road trip from a geology perspective, what else kind of tops your list, Dale?
So why don't we do a road trip? And what I would like to suggest in the Western Saskatchewan, let's do Highway 4. And what I like about doing Highway 4 is you start at the very south of the province in the grasslands, in the really, really dry grasslands. And it's such a stressed area climatically that it's not good for agriculture. So we've got this natural area that is preserved, and that's a great place to go see animals. And the processes, we talked about the meltwater channels, the badlands being formed. Then you keep going north to Swift Current, go a little bit to the west, and you get to Saskatchewan Landing Provincial Park. And there's a big, deep meltwater channel. Again, the river valley was cut during the last glaciation. But what's really interesting about Saskatchewan Landing Provincial Park, and when you go further west, it's the trees that live there are cottonwood poplars. And really, they'll be the only greenness that you've got in the area quite often all summer long. And I call them prairie oases when you get east of Empress, because you'll get hundreds of different species of birds living there. You get 60, 70 species of birds nesting in those trees. You can branch off a little bit further to the west and go to Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park. And it's another kind of oasis in our prairies, but it's 1,000 feet, 300 meters higher than the surrounding prairie level. It's got its own microclimate there. And to keep going north.
Oh, its own microclimate. I just want to pause and take that's cool.
So what's a microclimate?
I just find that so interesting.
It's higher up, so it cools off. It's a little bit cooler than the prairie levels. Also, it's always wet. Not always wet, but we get more thunderstorms going through there. And so you get more pine trees in there because of the increased rainfall, the increased humidity there. That's what I mean by the microclimate.
Love that. Okay, so we're there. Then what?
Then you keep going north to North Battleford, and then you're well into the aspen parkland there. You've lost the cottonwood forest, but we've got another really deep river valley. It's the North Saskatchewan River Valley that's cutting through the parkland there, and there's all sorts of animals that live there. We've talked about moose, elk. There used to be bison all through there as well. And so doing that road trip, again, Highway 4 is such a great trip. You could take 2 days to do it. You could take a week to do it, and zipping off to the east and the west and see different places. Another one that I like to do is Highway 35 in the east part of the province, and starting down south in the Weyburn area, and going north, and you cross Trans-Canada, you go to the Qu'Appelle Valley that Trevor just talked about. Again, there's so much to see. It's such a great ecologically significant area. And then you head up north, and you eventually get wherever you cross river valleys, they're deep, and there's no agriculture in there, and so they're great places to look at the animals. In the south, most people don't realize that Saskatchewan's got a lot of western painted turtles. And in the river valleys, particularly in the southern part of the province, you can find these western painted turtles, and I think they're so interesting as well. They live in slow-moving, sluggish rivers, like the Frenchman, like the creeks that you might find in the Qu'Appelle River Valley, and they lay their eggs once or twice a year, and they survive on the floodplains where the river's sort of meandering really slowly through the valley bottoms.
I'll tell you about one road trip that I did. My husband and I were reminiscing about a camping trip we did last year. And I feel like I need to travel with someone like you, Dale, to fully appreciate where I was. But I'll give you like the mom version of the camping trip we took last summer. Have you ever been to Pine Cree Regional Park?
No, I have not.
Oh my gosh. I mean, how would I describe it? It's, you're close to East End. So I'm sure you can picture East End.
I've been there.
Right? Okay.
I did research in the East End area.
Of course you did. So you can go to the Dinosaur Museum in East End. There's pottery places to check out, but the landscape there, right? You are in Saskatchewan. Like it's beautiful. But then Pine Cree Regional Park, you go down a hill and then you're in this little valley, and it almost feels like you're in British Columbia or parts of Alberta, where if you look up, you think you'd see mountains because of the lush kind of forested area and the creek that runs through. And to me, that was the most interesting Saskatchewan trip that I had taken, where you could see so much. It took quite a drive from Saskatoon to get there, but then once you were there, 10 minutes, you're looking at one thing. You're looking at, the vast prairie, and then you drive down a hill, and it's a totally different scene. So that's the road trip that I'll suggest.
Yeah, and you're up on the prairie level, and then you're down low. It's in those meltwater channels that were cut by when the glacial lakes drained. Another part of the country that I like is the Missouri Coteau. And so as you drive across Saskatchewan, either the Trans-Canada Highway, you see these big, big hills. And it took me a long time to understand how they got there. Or you go north of Lake Diefenbaker, and you'll see them in through there, and it's rangeland. It's really rugged topography. It's really hilly. And those were big ridges that were thrust by the glaciers, 15,000 years ago. And it made these ridges that are almost like small mountains in the prairies. People that say the prairies are boring or Saskatoon prairies are boring, they just haven't been to
I just don't want to hear it anymore. Come on.
Exactly. All these neat places we've got. And so look at the Missouri Coteau.
Okay.
Any of those highlands when you're driving through central Saskatchewan, south central Saskatchewan, up towards Lloydminster. They're all through there.
Well, this has been just really, really wonderful. And I'm going to suggest a podcast episode that I did at the very start because we were asked the question. I host Blue Sky, but we also have this podcast, Good Questions Saskatchewan. And Kevin Weedmark from Moosomin asked, why is Highway 1 where it is? If you just veered a bit south or went north, you'd see those rolling hills. You'd see a totally different topography. And so when people drive that number 1 highway, they're like, Saskatchewan is flat and boring. And so we dug into why the highway is located where it is. So it's we've got a bit of a theme going on here because it is July and it's road trip season. So this show fits in with that. And I would suggest giving that podcast a listen as well.
I'm going to check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, Dale, it's been great having you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is Dale Leckie, a professional geologist and professor of Earth, Environment, and Energy at the University of Calgary. He's also the author of the new book, Wildlife, Landscape, and Geology in Alberta and Saskatchewan Touring Guide. We also had guests today talking about the Qu'Appelle Valley. That was Trevor Harriott, who spoke about some very interesting flora and fauna on the show. And then Nick Cairns was also one of our guests, the newly appointed curator at the Royal Alberta Museum. But until just recently, he called Val-Marie home and spoke so highly of that part of the province. I'll share one more email with you from Mike, who writes, there's no better place to see flora and fauna than the Cypress Hills. I'm pleased that Dale mentioned the Cypress Hills. I was afraid that the program might run out of time without mentioning them. Last weekend at the Cypress Hills, we saw a flock of pelicans aggressively feeding on the fish in the lake and foxes, including 2 young playing in front of a den just off a side road. You never know what you might see, including a moose or 2. So thanks so much for listening and sharing all of your stories. Really appreciate it. I'm Alicia Grabinski. You've been listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. That's 94.1 FM in Saskatoon, 102.5 FM in Regina, 540 on the AM dial.